Good day. In a further major but entirely predictable twist in the US-China confrontation, which is the event which is dominating this summer, we have now had an announcement from the Pentagon that the United States is going to sell weapons to Taiwan. Now, Taiwan, of course, is an island off the shore of China, which China says is part of its national territory. And by the way, and it's important perhaps to remember, that Taiwan itself, or at least the government of Taiwan, for the moment accepts that Taiwan is part of China. Officially and formally, the name of the government of the country that is in control of Taiwan is the Republic of China, which distinguishes it from the People's Republic of China, which is the sovereign entity with control of the mainland. These two territories, mainland China and Taiwan, are part of, at the moment, the unfinished civil war that raged in China in the 1920s and 30s and 40s, and which led to the victory of the Chinese Communist Party and of the People's Liberation Army in 1949, which resulted in the previous government of China, the Kuomintang government, led by Chiang Kai-shek, to withdraw to the island of Taiwan and to continue the struggle from there. That has been the juridical and legal position accepted by both governments, the government in Taipei, in Taiwan, and the government in Beijing, in China at the moment. Until very recently, both governments accepted and considered Taiwan and China to be part of one and the same country, that country being China. What we have seen, however, happen recently is an independence movement gain strength in Taiwan, a movement which accepts that Taiwan, or rather the Republic of China, will never re-establish itself as the government of the mainland, and which seeks, therefore, not reunification with the mainland, but independence for Taiwan as an independent country separated from China. China, which is to say the government of the People's Republic of China, utterly and completely rejects this position. In doing so, it is overwhelmingly supported by the people of mainland China, who of course form the overwhelming majority of the Chinese nation. They continue to insist that Taiwan is a part of China, an integral part of China, and they regard the actions taken by the Taiwanese authorities as they edge towards secession as simply that, secession of a part of China's national territory from itself by a government in Taiwan, which is now, in the eyes of the Chinese government in Beijing, purely and merely a rebel government. Well, I've just set out some of the history and some of the political background. Doubtless there is much more to say, which could be said both by people in China itself and by people in Taiwan. But of course, and again, to reiterate, the position I am setting out is not just the position of the Chinese government in Beijing. To my knowledge, it is also the position that the overwhelming majority of Chinese people share. It is the position that China is united and is one country, and that the actions which are being taken in Taiwan towards independence are moves towards secession. Now, I say all this because, of course, the United States, the Pentagon, is now going to supply weapon systems to Taiwan, and the weapon systems that are being supplied by the United States to Taiwan are weapon systems which China considers to be weapon systems supplied to a secessionist government, one which is preparing to rebel formally from China. Now, I again have gone into this in some detail to explain why this is such an important issue for China. But it is one which we have been drifting towards for some time. Now, when the United States recognized the government in Beijing as the legal government of China back in the 1970s, it ceased to consider Taiwan, or rather the government in Taipei, in Taiwan, to be the Chinese government. And for many years afterwards, the United States left the situation basically alone. There was a kind of implicit understanding between the United States and China that the situation in Taiwan would be allowed to take care of itself. The Taiwanese and the Chinese, it was expected by both governments, the government in Beijing and the government in Washington, would eventually find a way to sort out their differences and to integrate together. At that time, of course, Taiwan did not seek, in any significant way, actual independence from China, and there was a time when relations between China and Taiwan actually became very close. And of course, the Chinese government from the 1980s onward promoted the policy of one nation, two systems. It was applied to Hong Kong, it was applied to places like Macau, and the anticipation was that it would be applied to Taiwan too, and that Taiwan would eventually find some way to integrate itself with China, accepting the unity of China, but also preserving a high degree of domestic autonomy. And I have to say straight away that that still seems to me the optimal solution. But over the last few years, that policy has gradually unraveled. The United States, from having seen China as a partner, has now come to see China as an adversary and even as an enemy, as Chinese economic and political and military power threatens to exceed that of the United States itself, something which the United States finds unbearable and which it is completely unreconciled to. And the United States, as a result, has been open in backing movements which oppose the government in Beijing in places like Hong Kong and now in Taiwan itself. And of course, the new administration in Washington has taken the further step of appearing to support movements towards potential secession in Taiwan by selling weapons to the government in Taipei. Now, it should be said that the weapon systems that we're talking about are 40 155mm M109A6 medium self-propelled artillery howitzers. This is not a game changer by any means. It is in effect almost, you could say, a token sale of weapons, though it has to be said that the price that Taiwan will pay for these weapons comes to $750 million, which is, by most measures, a substantial amount of money. But in any event, it is not going to change. This sale of weapons is not going to change the military balance significantly in Taiwan or between Taiwan and China or along the Taiwan Strait. However, it is coming with reports that Japan, a major regional power, is considering deploying anti-aircraft and anti-ship missile units in Ishigaki, which is just 185 miles from Taiwan, and that these will be part of a joint defense system agreed between the United States, Japan, and Taiwan in order to defend Taiwan itself. So there we go. This is where we're heading. We're heading towards the United States now starting to arm Taiwan, even though to only a limited extent, and to Japan also providing, or rather deploying, missile systems, anti-aircraft and anti-ship missile systems just 185 miles from Taiwan, in a system, assuming a military posture, which appears to be directed increasingly against China and which seems to be intended to defend Taiwan from China. Anyway, where is all this going? Where are we heading with all of this? Well, let's first of all discuss the Chinese reaction to these arms sales. I should say this is not the first arms sale that has taken place on the part of the United States to Taiwan in recent years, but arms sales began in a limited way under the Trump administration, but some had hoped or expected that the Biden administration would take a different policy and would revert to the more hands-off policies on this issue, followed by previous administrations, which have up to now tended to avoid taking steps like selling arms to Taiwan, which the Chinese in Beijing would definitely see as provocative. So what is the Chinese reaction to this? And we have had, again, the predictable response set out in an editorial in Global Times. And it reads in part as follows. The armed forces in the island of Taiwan hope that the addition of these US self-propelled howitzers will increase their anti-landing capabilities and deter the People's Liberation Army. This is a naive idea. The Taiwan authorities have fallen into a narrow mindset and have the vision of their armed forces, and so have the vision of the armed forces in Taiwan. If an all-out war breaks out across the Taiwan Straits, the People's Liberation Army will definitely carry out a saturation attack on Taiwan's military targets. Chen Shui-ban, former regional leader of Taiwan, said in 2007 that the Chinese mainland has over 1,000 ballistic missiles aimed at the island. Now the People's Liberation Army must be able to mobilize more and stronger forces for the first round of strikes. At that time, none of the targets in Taiwan, ranging from airports to missile and artillery positions to the military command center, can survive. And Taiwan's transportation will immediately be disrupted. Will there be any scope for the island to exploit the capabilities of its self-propelled howitzers? There's only a limited land for land facing the Chinese mainland on which Taiwan's self-propelled howitzers can move around. The People's Liberation Army is clearly aware of the location of every house or tree there. Against this backdrop, can self-propelled howitzers be manoeuvred under the PLA's nose? Even if some of the self-propelled howitzers survived, will the terrified soldiers in Taiwan be able to drive or aim them? The armed forces in Taiwan should be clear that once a war breaks out, the only way to survive is to surrender, and all resistance is pointless. It is believed that many soldiers in Taiwan see joining the military as a career, and they gamble they will not encounter a war. Once a war takes place, an overwhelming saturation attack from the Chinese mainland will instantly destroy the morale of the entire armed forces of Taiwan, and all the weapons and equipment sold by the US to Taiwan will either become the spoils of the PLA or will be destroyed immediately. Taiwan's security can only be achieved through political means. That is to accept the one China principle, draw a clear line from the US strategy to contain the Chinese mainland, actively discuss ways of peaceful reunification with the mainland, and follow the right path of one country, two systems. Using force to resist reunification or seek secessionism is a dead end for the Taiwan authorities. Speaking of Japan's military construction on the islands close to Taiwan to deter the situation in Taiwan, it is equivalent to being a cannon fodder of the US to contain what China's rise. Once a war breaks out in the Taiwan Straits and a missile targeting the PLA is launched from Japanese islands, those islands will immediately suffer from saturation attacks. China's DF-17 hypersonic missile is very suitable for this task. Now, and then it goes on to say things like Chinese people love peace. China has already become the world's largest trading country, and China's super industrial production capacity is benefiting all mankind. The US and China should not force China to use such power to produce ballistic missiles which can completely destroy their fleet and Asia-Pacific military base. For China, producing these ballistic missiles is no more difficult than producing ventilators. China is Japan's largest trading partner. There are many Japanese-made cars on the streets of China, and many Japanese products are widely welcomed by Chinese consumers. China should focus on doing business with China and drop the illusion of confronting 1.4 billion Chinese people. Well, there is, of course, a great deal of passionate language here about saturating Taiwan with ballistic missile systems, about the Taiwanese people, the Taiwanese government pursuing secession, about Japan acting as cannon fodder for the United States. So there is a great deal of emotional and passionate language. But one has to say that on any analysis, there is also here more than substance. There is, in fact, underlying truth. For Japan and Taiwan, and indeed for the United States, to try to take on China in areas so close to China's border is militarily illogical to the point of suicidal. Deploying 40 self-propelled howitzers to Taiwan is not going to change the military balance. Taiwan itself is an industrialized country. It is technologically exceptionally advanced. It makes the world's best microprocessors. It can produce lots of weapon systems by itself, but ultimately it simply cannot match the far more gigantic, immeasurably more gigantic industrial and technological system that is being developed in China and on the Chinese mainland. And Japan obviously also has a mighty industrial base, but can it really engage China in that sort of war? And what benefit does Japan ultimately derive from that? Why should Japan risk its own survival, or at least the survival of large part of its armed forces, by pulling American coals out of the fire, by coming to the rescue of Taiwan? None of this makes any sort of sense. And of course, for the United States, as has been confirmed in that now legendary war game that took place in October of last year, for the United States to try to deploy its naval forces to Taiwan and to try and defend Taiwan, that looks beyond reckless. And I'm well aware that there are many people who think that Taiwan itself is, highly defensible and can deter a Chinese invasion. And, it's because it's mountainous and it's because it's well defended. It could risk, the Chinese would be taking on enormous military risks if they were to attack Taiwan. Well, all I can say about that is that consider the price Taiwan would have to pay and the people of Taiwan would have to pay, even if that were true, which, by the way, I strongly doubt that it is. I would add that Scott Ritter, former US Marine officer, a person with immense technological knowledge, far greater than I possess, has apparently been saying, I haven't heard the broadcasts myself, that if China's enormous industrial strengths are combined with Russia's technological prowess in developing hypersonic systems, then frankly it is game over, not just on the Straits of Taiwan, but pretty much everywhere else where the Chinese and the Russians come together and agree to pursue their common military interests. It would provide a military match which no one else could hope to challenge. So I think all this talk of confronting China on the Taiwan Straits should be completely put aside, and it is wiser and far better to do what the Global Times article advises, which is for Taiwan to accept that the best solution is a political and diplomatic one, to seek ways to negotiate with China some acceptance of Chinese sovereignty over the island, perhaps some wider acceptance that China will have some kind of say over Taiwan's foreign policy positions, perhaps even that the Chinese People's Liberation Army should have a presence, perhaps a token presence, on Taiwanese territory, but with Taiwan being left to take care of its own domestic matters much as before. And I appreciate that there are particular issues that many people have about Hong Kong, and they'll say that one country, two systems hasn't worked very well in Hong Kong. But that has been partly, I think, because the situation in Hong Kong has been so different, with Hong Kong being so close and indeed part of, in many cases, the Chinese mainland. And I think that one should not make the mistake of applying too much of the experience of Hong Kong to the situation in Taiwan, which is, in my opinion, completely different. Anyway, a political diplomatic solution seems to me to be the wise one and the correct one. But to my mind, this is not actually and ultimately the biggest single question. Because to my mind, the single biggest reason why we are seeing these tensions grow, why there are secessionist movements growing in Taiwan, why the situation between Taiwan and China is deteriorating, why the situation between Japan and China is deteriorating, has nothing to do ultimately with the situation in Taiwan itself. Rather, it is all connected with this massive deterioration in relations between China and the United States, which we have seen over the last 2 years. And that deterioration is being driven by this fear the United States has of the rise of Chinese power, the rise, first and foremost, of Chinese economic and technological power, and the concern that the United States will shortly no longer be the biggest economic bloc country in the world, the richest country in the world, that it will be facing a country that is economically stronger and richer than itself. And this seems to be creating an extraordinary panic in Washington on the part of the US political class, and a desire to try and block and contain China and to somehow keep China under control, and in fact to suppress China's rise in any way which is possible. And this is leading to all these dangerous plans of backing secessionist movements in Taiwan, but backing dissident movements in Hong Kong, trying to create alliances between countries like Taiwan and Japan, and trying to win over the countries of Southeast Asia to form some kind of alliance against China. All of this, to my mind, is completely misguided and utterly wrong. It is creating problems and conflicts between countries like Japan and Taiwan and China, which are absolutely not in the interests of Taiwan and Japan and potentially the countries of Southeast Asia. And of course, ultimately, it threatens to lead the United States itself into a military confrontation with China, which, in my opinion, can only end either in the US's defeat or, perish the thought, in a nuclear exchange, which would be a catastrophe for the United States and, of course, China, and indeed for all of humanity. It is astonishing to me how this whole situation, this entirely legitimate competition, economic competition between great powers, has spiraled out of control. So now that we are looking at not just a geopolitical conflict, but a military geopolitical conflict between the United States and China, which the United States cannot win, and which it looks like being comprehensively outmatched. I do wonder to what extent the United States leadership has thought this through and understands and realizes what it is doing. It is still time to stop. There is still time to stop, to take a step back, to think through the implications of what is happening. I hope that that is what will happen. But I fear that it is not. It seems to me that what is happening is that we're going to have, before very long, a major crisis on the Taiwan Straits, a possible clash between the US and Chinese navies, possible threats between China and the United States, and a situation where perhaps the United States will be forced to pull back. The Chinese have already made the point that in the 1960s, when US power, military power, relatively was much stronger than it is today, the United States was unable to defeat a small country like Vietnam. How much less likely is it that the United States can prevail in an armed clash against China? So why is the United States taking these reckless moves, these foolish steps of selling token amounts of weapons to a country like Taiwan? I understand that political partisanship in the United States makes it very difficult for the United States to make concessions. But it also seems to me the case, and I say it again, that over the last year, perhaps as a result of the pandemic, the situation in the United States has reached the point where it has become almost an ideological imperative to challenge China across the board, even in places like the Taiwan Straits. Well, this is foolish, it is reckless to the point of being delusional. If I were freer to speak out, I would actually use stronger language to describe it. It is not language, that it is not the actions that one would expect of a great power. And I hope that the United States will come to its senses and will understand the dangers of what it is doing. Anyway, I have done many programs in recent days about the situation between the United States and China. I don't apologize for doing that. It is, my opinion, the biggest story in the world today by far, and it is also the case that this summer we have now seen a line being crossed. We've come to a position where both the United States and China have come to see each other not just as rivals, but indeed as enemies, and where, as I discussed in my previous video, the armies of the two blocs, the one led by the United States and the one led by China, are now actively training and exercising in preparation for a conflict with each other. This, to mind, is an alarming, a frightening thing, and I would reiterate again what I have said many times, that the experience of the Cold War, the confrontation between the United States and the Soviet Union, provides a very poor guide to what may happen. I hope that wiser counsels will eventually prevail, most especially in Washington, but I fear that they will not, in which case, as I said, things have the potential to take a disastrous turn. I hope that this will be the last